then the next thing we'll be talking about is peer review. Peer review means that when you submit a paper for publication, or in most granting agencies when you submit a grant for potential funding, it is reviewed by peers, that is, by other scientists. So that seems to be the fairest way of doing it. I've been doing a little reading about this, and it turns out that this process of peer review of journal articles, which was later extended to grants, actually began in the 1600s in England, when the invention of the printing press led to the dissemination of science. Journals were formed, and most scientists really didn't have the ability to publish their own books, and if they did, it would take so long that even by the standards of the 1600s, it would be too slow. So journals were formed that would publish articles, and scientists would send in articles and the journals would publish them. But initially, that was just kind of a business. Send in your article and we publish it. And that was a pretty good business model, but the problem was that some of those articles were no good. And no one could really tell when something was published whether they could believe it or not. And so the Royal Academy of Sciences established a policy that no articles would be published unless several scientists in the same field would look at them and decide that they really merited publication. And when you think about it, that's a pretty good idea. That's why we have so much faith in our journal articles. And as we discussed before, we may not agree with the conclusions or the discussion, but we can pretty much take the attitude that if someone said they did an experiment, they present the results, those results are real, and at least someone has reviewed it and felt that not only are they real, but they're significant and important and worth our time in reading. We certainly hate to read an article and when you get done reading it, say, there's nothing new here. Everything's been published before. This is not interesting. I don't know why I spent all that time reading it. So hopefully that should never happen. So the basic process of peer review is often a little bit opaque to the new person going into science. There are basically two different types of people who are going to be looking at your articles. One are the editors, and the other are the reviewers. Now, the editor will probably be a scientist, or may not be, but generally will be in most journals. And the editor will be the person who would look at the article when it first gets submitted. And the editor will make a decision on that article. Does this article belong in this journal or not? So especially if you're writing papers for example, Cell Science and Nature, which people often think of as the epitome of biomedical research. If you submit an article to Science, Cell, or Nature, you will probably within 48 to 72 hours get an answer back from the editor. And the editor will either say, our journal is not interested in reviewing this paper, send it someplace else. On the other hand, the editor may say, well, less commonly, will say, well, this topic of this paper seems to be of interest to our journal, so now I'm going to send it out to reviewers. So in that case, you still have to wait for what the reviewers will do. Now, one thing that's a lot of people don't realize, but if you're, that's first of all, it's a good thing that process occurs in those high-impact journals because they are very hard to get into, and it's really great if you write an article and if it's going to get rejected, at least you'd like to have it rejected in 48 hours because now you can submit it someplace else. You'd hate for them to sit on it for a few months and then tell you submit it someplace else. So that's good. And one thing you can often do which wasn't so much done in my day, but is now becoming very common, is if you're writing an article, maybe even if you haven't quite finished writing the article yet, and you think, wow, this is really important finding, I think this is something that Science would want to publish, you can write to the editor of Science and in a relatively short letter, 1 or 2 pages, say, I am studying this phenomenon, I'm writing this paper, would this be of interest to your journal? Now, the editor isn't going to just give you a blank check and say, we will accept it. That's not up to the editor, really. But the editor will probably answer your letter, probably within a week, and will say, yes, that's interesting. If this paper has merit, we would consider publishing it. Or the editor might say to you, that's a very interesting subject, but it really isn't the sort of thing that we're going to put in Science. You might want to send it to a journal in your specialty rather than into a more general journal like Science. And again, that's a very nice thing to know before you write the paper, because you can save yourself a lot of trouble putting it into the format for one journal and then having to take it and put it into the format of another. Once the editor decides that, okay, we received the paper, if this paper has any merit, it is a topic that would be of interest to our journal for us to publish for our readers, now we have to decide, does it actually have scientific merit? And now it goes out to the reviewers. And the reviewers, in fact, are other scientists. And those reviewers will write reviews. Generally, they will be anonymous. The editor knows who they are, but you who submitted the article will not know who they are. And the reviewers, then will give the editor a written report that will include a recommendation of whether the paper should be published or not, and will also request certain things to be changed. Then the editor reviews those reviewers' comments. If the editor is in the field, if there's disagreement among those reviewers, the editor, if they're in the right field, may even look at the article themselves, but generally will not look at it in any depth. And then the editor will generally synthesize those reviews, usually 2 or 3 of them, and will forward them with the names removed on back to you, the author, with a cover letter, and the cover letter will generally say one of 3 things. And it's very important when you receive one of these letters to look at it carefully and make sure you really realize what it's saying, because I've seen people misinterpret these letters, sometimes burning a great deal of adrenaline for no reason. Probably the rarest of these letters is one that says, your article is accepted for publication. In my initial submission of papers, I suppose maybe once or twice that's happened. It hardly ever happens that an article gets accepted for publication with no changes at all. It just virtually never happens. What is more common is you get back and you say, this article is not yet ready for publication. However, with the following changes, we would be very interested in publishing it. And it's very important to read what they say, because sometimes it's very nice. You get a letter say, you fixed this little thing, you fixed that little thing, and we'd be delighted to publish the paper. Sometimes it says, well, this particular question hasn't been answered in this paper. You need to do experiments that answer that question, and without that answer, we will not be ready to publish it. So then you have to say, wow, now I got to go back, I got to do experiments, I got to rewrite. That's a serious consideration. So you have to really decide, when you get this kind of an answer, well, does this mean I rewrite the paper, or does this mean I go back to the lab, or does this mean I think about another journal? And of course, another possibility is rejection. Editor just says, look, we're sorry, this is not publishable. We may have a few specific critiques of it, but don't bother resubmitting, because even if these things were fixed, we don't want to publish it. And again, that's useful information for you, because now at least they can tell you why it was rejected, and now you have the option potentially of fixing those things and perhaps going to another journal. So how do you respond when you get one of these? Well, the first thing I always recommend, and I always try to do myself, is when I get one back that doesn't simply say your article is accepted, which of course is what almost always happens, is they're not accepted. The first thing I always do is I read what comes back in that letter, and I usually then wait 24 hours before I do anything. And that's a very good idea. Don't do anything while you're very emotional, which you will be. I mean, you've put your heart and soul into this paper, and it's not getting published, and you are not a happy camper, and you don't want to do something bad, So calm down. That's the first thing. Maybe if you have collaborators, you might want to show them the letter, but wait 24 hours. A general rule is when you get a review back, don't refute your review. I often have young investigators, junior faculty or postdocs or students come to me and say, I've gotten my reviews back. How do I refute them? No, 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 no. You don't refute the reviewers. You thank the reviewers for helping you to write a better paper. And what you have to say in your mind is, well, this reviewer didn't understand what I wrote. That doesn't mean the reviewer is an idiot, although you might think that. When they correct my paper, they're always idiots. But no, that isn't really what your attitude has to be. Your attitude has to be, well, I know what I meant. Somehow I didn't write it clearly enough for this reviewer to understand. So I will write it more clearly so even this not so bright reviewer will understand it. Because after all, that may be, the reviewer probably has the amount of knowledge comparable to what the reader of this journal has. I want the reader to understand this. I mean, that's the whole point of publishing, right? You want other people to know what you've done. So, very important that and you don't have to necessarily accept every single critique by every reviewer, but you must at least comment on those critiques. I mean, it's perfectly all right to say, I have not included the information requested by reviewer number 2 in my materials and methods section because if you look at the caption of figure 1, in fact, that information is presented there. That's perfectly all right. You can, there is room, you can go back and forth. But in general, I would say the majority of the comments of the reviewers should be acted upon. Now, if you either have to do extensive rewriting or you get rejected, one option that you may have to follow, certainly it's not an unheard of thing, is to simply say, okay, this is not going into this journal. Maybe I'll send it somewhere else. And that's certainly a reasonable thing to do. Very often, something that is not of great interest or not in sufficient detail for one journal might very well be perfectly acceptable for a different journal with a somewhat different focus. On the other hand, even if you're going to go to a different journal, I strongly recommend that you do whatever you can to answer or address the questions raised by the reviewers. Because remember, the journals go to the experts in your field and send them your manuscript. So when you go to the new journal, these experts may in fact have the same objection that the previous ones had, and for all you know, they might even be the same people. So, you have to be careful. So you can, sometimes you can get back to the editor in your letter. When I say discussion, it's usually not actually a conversation, but really a letter. Sometimes there are opportunities to, in a way, sort of refute things. For example, you might have 2 different reviewers who have opposite comments on the same thing. And then it's perfectly acceptable for you to write a letter to the editor and say, look, reviewer number 1 feels that this particular thing is wrong, but reviewer number 2 thinks it's fine. I'd like more clarification, and I think this really may not have to be changed. But again, always be respectful, and remember, the reviewers are your friends. I've sometimes actually seen papers in which, in the acknowledgments section, an author will say, I wish to thank the anonymous reviewer who recommended such and such, which made this a much better publication. So reviewers can really be a help to you. I know when they tell you you've got to do another experiment, it's not always a pleasant thing, but sometimes it's a damn good experiment. So, bear that in mind. Now, the fact that your reviewers are other scientists is a potential problem. There may be a conflict of interest in that, let's say those other scientists are your collaborators. Maybe not on this project, but on some other project. Well, those scientists, if they feel their reputation will be improved the more successful you are, they may have a bias saying, I really want my collaborator to get this paper accepted, so I'm going to say only good things about it. Or maybe the other scientist is someone else who works in your field, and they're in a race with you to solve this problem. And they read your paper, you say, oh my God, you solved this problem before I did. I'm going to give this a terrible review so I can get my paper out before yours gets published. Maybe yours will never get published after the things I'm going to say about you. So technically, if we have a conflict of interest, we're supposed to recuse ourselves from being a reviewer. So when I'm asked to review papers, I will generally get a letter saying, so-and-so, they'll give me the name of the person, has submitted a paper to us with the following title. Do you feel you can be a reviewer? And generally my answer is yes. I always feel it's important to science for people who are experts to help their fellow scientists by being reviewers. But I will usually say, I must point out that, I previously collaborated with this person in 1995. And I might say, but I don't work in that field anymore, so I feel I wouldn't have a conflict of interest. And occasionally I'll say I do have a conflict of interest. Maybe I collaborate with that person and very closely, and I would be biased, or I, have had some battle with that person, and I could not give them a fair review. I've never felt that way, but I can imagine that could happen, and then you should recuse yourselves. And I'll tell you something which happened to me just this year. I got a grant to review, and as I was reviewing the grant, and they asked me if I have conflict of interest. I said no. It was a person I didn't know at a university I had no affiliation with. And then I reviewed the grant, and as I reviewed the grant, about page 10 of the grant, I noticed that the person who applied for that grant mentioned that they were collaborating with another scientist. Another scientist happened to be a person who, over 30 years ago, I did a postdoctoral fellowship in their lab. So, I didn't feel that was really a conflict of interest, but there was a place on the review form where you could write in, special comments to the organizers of the review, and I wrote in, I don't feel I have a conflict of interest, but I just want to point out that this grant mentions a collaboration with such and such a lab, and I collaborated with that group. I did a postdoctoral training with that particular group they collaborated with, and in fact I published some papers with them for the 10 years following my postdoctoral fellowship. So, it's right out in the open. The best thing, again, for conflicts of interest is to make them exposed. But anyhow, you're supposed to have confidentiality and fairness in these reviews, but it's a real problem because, again, what happens if you're reading a review and all of a sudden you're reading a grant or a paper and you see a really good idea that can help you in your research? Well, that's a problem. You have to then figure out how to deal with that. But by the same token, you don't want people, it would be a terrible thing, let's say, I certainly would hate it if all my papers were given to people who knew nothing about science and nothing about my field. I want experts to read my papers, right? So, there's a real problem here. There is an inherent problem with peer review. Now, one thing you can do as an author in the peer review process is some journals will ask you to, for example, suggest reviewers. Because very often an editor, especially in a relatively general journal, the editor may say, well, gee, I work in, ecology of plants, and I got this article about cancer. Who am I going to get to review this? So isn't it nice if the person submitting it says, well, I can recommend the following people whom I have no conflict of interest with, who aren't at my school and I don't collaborate with, who might serve as good reviewers. So that can be a nice thing. Of course, you can't list, like your brother-in-law and your thesis advisor, and that's not allowed. They have to be people who you don't have a conflict of interest with. In general, though, journals mostly won't do that. They'll generally, where will they get the reviewers? Either they know who the experts in the field are, or they'll look at the footnotes in your paper and see who you cited and send it to those people. That's a very common way of finding reviewers. So bear that in mind. The people you cite may be your reviewers. Now, you can request specific exclusion. So let's say you're in a battle to the death to solve a problem with this other lab at this other university. Or you have this horrible personal interaction with this one person in your field, and you just feel that person would never be fair to you. You can request a particular person to be excluded, and most editors will honor that. However, I would use that very sparingly. I have only a few times in my life done that, and in each case it was only for one person for whom was in my field and who I felt would be very problematic for a variety of reasons if they reviewed my work. But it doesn't look good for you, for example, if you submitted an article for publication and you say, here is a list of people who I don't want to review my paper. Then the editor is going to write and say, well, what's wrong with you? I mean, how many people have you offended in your career? That, in general, it's something, like I say, I think in maybe 2 or 3 times in my life I have actually done that, but it's relatively rare. So, I would recommend against that unless there is some very unusual circumstance. The other thing about the peer reviewers is generally they work by themselves, and then the editor puts together the different reviews, and they're mostly anonymous. Now, that's what you as an author can expect. So you would not want to have, for example, your peer reviewers, showing your unpublished work to all sorts of other people before it comes out. So when you're a reviewer yourself, and remarkably soon many of you will be reviewers, because once you've published a paper, the editors will know who you are and they'll come looking for you. You have to remember that you have to preserve the rights of the authors. And again, usually the reviews are anonymous. Now, that has been a problem for some people. Some people say, gee, well, isn't that kind of unfair? Because, here the reviewer knows who I am. They may pick on me because they don't like me or something, but I don't know who they are. They can say the most outrageous thing, and I have no way of responding to that knowing who it is. So there are some journals, and in fact some reviewers have actually requested that they no longer do it anonymously, and in fact when the review comes back, it is signed by a person. And some journals will give the reviewers the option of do they want it to be anonymous or not. I must admit there are things to be said both ways, but having the reviews anonymous, especially for younger investigators, I think is a very good thing. I would certainly hate to be the person who is reviewing some powerful head of a laboratory or highly paced professor, Nobel Prize winner, and here I am, maybe a young assistant professor, and I have something bad to say about that person and their work. I wouldn't want, and then that person is maybe reviewing my grant 6 months later. That would not be such a good thing. So I think most reviewers really will not have, be as open in their ability to communicate if they don't have the shield of anonymity. But some people say, well, maybe the writers should also have that shield. A very interesting thing, I now have a Gates Foundation grant, and the Gates Foundation wants to have they have what they call the Grand Challenges Explorations grants. And these are supposed to be grants that do something very novel. And they don't want the grants to be set up to be just, the same old people doing the same old thing, but better and better. So, in fact, when I wrote that grant application, that was an anonymous grant application. It was a grant application that didn't have my name on it and didn't have the name of my school on it. And it got reviewed by outside peer reviewers who didn't know who I was. And I kind of liked that idea, because especially I was going into a new field to work on malaria, which I had been teaching for many years, but hadn't done research on before. And I thought, now that's really fair. I don't know who they are. They don't know who I am. Now we're even. But of course, when you're evaluating most projects, whether it's a grant or a publication, you really want to know who the people are, because if someone has established a certain track record and has a certain reputation, that does say something about their abilities. Where if it's a person who's never done anything before, then you want certain documentation. If I see a full professor with many grants and many publications, I pretty much know that person knows how to run a lab and can do research. If it's a person who's never had a grant before, well, then maybe I'd like to see some documentation of, well, just has this person been well educated, and do they really know what they're getting into as they're doing that? So, there's something to be said for knowing who people are as well. Now, grant peer review may be a little bit different than journal peer review, in that there may be the reviewers may be ad hoc, that is just assembled, you write a grant on your topic and they find somebody who's an expert in your topic to review it, or there may be a panel of reviewers who review all the grants for that agency, and they're all experts in your particular field. Someone like the NIH has over 100 such panels, and they each serve for several years, and they're in different areas. In general, here the agency personnel kind of act like the editor did in the journal reviews, in that the agency personnel coordinate but generally don't review. It's the scientists, the peer reviewers, who do the actual reviewing. And there are different ways this may be done. So, for example, from the NIH, the reviewers get these grants. They review them in the privacy of their offices at home. They send them back to the NIH, and then they got an airplane and fly to Bethesda, and they all meet in one room. And if there's a disagreement between two reviewers, those people have to face each other across the table and hammer out why they disagree with each other. So now, I think that has a great deal of merit, because now you can't just go off and say something and come off without justification, because you may be dinged by the other reviewers. So, and I bet, it's interesting when you sit in these study sections, as I have, usually for most grants, you'll see 2 or 3 reviewers will all come up pretty much in agreement. But every once in a while, you see one where one reviewer says, this is really great project and a terrific investigator and very important. And another one says, yeah, this is not really so good as all that. I think this really doesn't have that much merit. And then you have to argue it back and forth. Then some other agencies like the NSF tend to rely on getting more ad hoc reviews, and those are mostly just mail-ins and they don't meet. So, for example, when I get my reviews back from the NIH, and you do get the reviews back from those agencies, usually the 3 reviews you get back kind of you can tell they're looking the same. From the NSF, you may get 5 or 6 reviews back, and very often you'll see those reviews are very, very different from each other, because they've never met across the table. So one review will say, this is a great grant, and the other review will say, this is a terrible grant. And of course, then you just have to start thinking, well, what is the truth? I don't know, so that's a problem. Again, confidentiality is important, and again, conflict of interest is important. And again, they ask those questions when you are a reviewer. They will always ask if you have a conflict of interest, and it's very important. If, for example, if I'm at an NIH review, not only can I not review a grant where I have a conflict of interest, for example, a grant from my university, but it will be expected if I'm at an NIH study section and a grant from my university comes up for discussion, I'm expected to leave the room while that discussion goes on. So I don't even hear what gets said. I not only didn't review it, but I didn't even hear who said what about it. And that, again, that's great protection both for the reviewer and the investigator. So here's a case of the kind of problem that you can get into with confidentiality. So while quietly sipping a soda and looking over the landscape at his departmental retreat, Professor Aaron Chen inadvertently focuses on the conversation at the next bench. Joe, a young faculty member, is talking to his graduate student, Yolanda. And Joe says, I know that reviewing papers for publication is part of our job, but the steady influx is exhausting me. The only saving grace is I get to learn about some pretty exciting science, which is true. It really is very, very, very exciting to do this kind of work. And Yolanda says, that's a pretty desirable burden compared with what I have to put up with as a teaching assistant. At least you get to learn something in the process. Come across anything particularly interesting? And here Joe does it. He says, well, since we don't work in this immediate area, I guess it's okay to talk about it. There's a report of a new cellular transcription factor that plays a powerful role in expression in virus-infected cells. It's been messing up everyone's in vitro transcription systems. It's easy to purify because it binds to the DNA binding region of the estrogen receptor and can be affinity purified from columns containing that region specifically. The paper is well written, and I am recommending publication with only minor corrections, so it should be out soon. And Yolanda says, fascinating, I can't wait to see it in print. Professor Chen, who's been overhearing this conversation, has been having great difficulty carrying out in vitro transcription with DNA from virus-infected cells, and has been wondering where to turn next. The overheard remark is like a gift from heaven. He then unexpectedly runs into his graduate student, Paul Loudon. Professor Chen, Paul, have you been thinking about how to get our in vitro transcription process to work better? Maybe the viruses induce new cellular transcription factors that are not present in normal cells. That's a great idea. We've been looking for technical problems for much too long. Why don't we try to find out? Professor Chen that says, let me tell you about what I overheard. I think we could get this project done in time to submit it just about when the other group publishes their finding. It surely makes science more efficient for us to get on the right track, and our study will validate their result if we can confirm its validity in our system. How would you assess the behavior of these people in this case? Any comments on that for Yolanda? Well, maybe we should come back to Yolanda. How about Joe, the assistant professor? Do you think Joe did anything wrong here? How many people say yes? How many people say no? What Joe did is fine. Okay, that's good. Okay, right. Because the key thing here is to maintain confidentiality. You got to think about this the same as if you were using a physician and you had a medical problem that your physician knew. You wouldn't want that physician in a crowded elevator using your name and discussing your medical problem. Right? Same thing here. When you're reviewing things confidentially, you're not supposed to share them. Now, how about supposing this had been done in private? Suppose this was in Joe's office and he'd been telling Yolanda about the paper. Would that be okay? I see a lot of heads shaking no. Anyone think yes? You're absolutely right. That would not be okay because, again, it's confidentiality. Now, sometimes it has happened to me, to other people, I'm sure, that I get a paper to review, and I say, you know, I know someone in my department who would be a much better reviewer for this paper than I would. Now, there would be a great temptation for me to go to that person and say, would you take a look at this paper and tell me what you think of it? But that's wrong. Now, what I can do is I can email the editor, and I can tell the editor, have you considered so-and-so as a potential reviewer, because they have just the expertise this paper needs. And the editor might even say, it's happened to me where an editor has gotten back to me and said, you know, that's a great idea. Would you do me a favor and forward this to them? Or the editor may say, you know, thank you very much, I'll consider that. But you can't just share that information. Now, how about Professor Chen? Yes?
It seems like he's trying to get a competitive edge with the other scientists in his field, and like we were talking about, it's unethical but he can't, if he overheard it just by coincidence, he's not really guilty for overhearing it, he's guilty for his action.
Well, still, he couldn't help overhearing it, but let's say as a full professor in the same department with Joe, what might Dr. Chen do at a later time?
He might try to execute or find that transcription factor.
Well, that's true. It's hard for him, once he knows it, it's hard not to do it, but, you know, but he's really put in a conflict of interest situation. But as a good faculty member, what should he be doing that no one has mentioned yet? Talk to Joe, yes. Here's Joe, a young assistant professor who probably doesn't know the rules, never had this case presented, and you know, he's made a big mistake in how he's handled this information. It would be a really appropriate thing in private for Dr. Chen to call Joe in and say, you know, I overheard you. You really shouldn't do this. This is a mistake. This could hurt your career. But it's a real problem for Dr. Chen. What is Dr. Chen supposed to do now? I think it's really, it really puts him in a difficult situation. But clearly, utilizing that information is wrong. But it would be much easier for Dr. Chen had he never heard it. But this really puts Joe in a problem. Let's say he learns what's happened. You know, what should he do? Well, maybe that's something we should think about. But the easiest thing for all these problems is to avoid them in the first place. So I think the main thing you want to remember is you expect confidentiality when you submit a paper or grant. As you're reviewing these things, it's very important for you to respect the confidentiality of the people who have submitted them, because if not, you know, obviously bad things can happen. Anyone want to discuss this case any further, or shall we go on? Okay. Here's another case. Ann Baldwin is a postdoctoral fellow working in a highly specialized area of research on lentiviruses and prions. Her boss, Dr. Richardson, recognizes Ann's talents and believes that she is the most promising postdoctoral fellow in his lab. Ann's contributions have included aiding Dr. Richardson in identifying a rather obscure pathway by which the prion responsible for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a degenerative brain disorder, emerges from years of latency to initiate active infection. When Dr. Richardson is asked by a leading neurobiology journal to review an article on the pathology of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, he decides to involve Ann because of her skills and specialized experience. He makes a copy of the manuscript and asks Ann to write her own critical review of the piece, just as if she were the actual reviewer. This exercise, he reasons, would afford Anne a good opportunity for exposure to the process of peer review while putting her in touch with the latest literature on her primary field of research. Is Dr. Richardson's an idea a good one, and why or why not? Okay. Do you think how many people think Dr. Richardson had a good idea? Okay, well, I can understand that. Because that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. You could have given one of his own articles to review. That would be a very good thing. In fact, one thing we always do in our department actually is before we submit an article, we're always supposed to have people from other laboratories review the article as if they were the reviewers, so that we get the feedback from them before we send it out. How could he have shared the article with Anne? Is there a way? Huh? Post-publication. How could he have done it right now? Couldn't ask the authors. The editor is not supposed. One of the things they tell me when I'm reviewing a journal, they say, don't contact the authors. If you have a problem, if I have a problem as a reviewer, who do I contact? The editor. So, just like the story I told you before with one of my colleagues, if he really thought that Anne would be a good reviewer, he could ask the editor, might I have my senior postdoctoral fellow who has published extensively on this field be a reviewer for this paper? The editor might say no, but the editor editors are always hunting around for reviewers. The editor might say, this is a great idea, I've got another reviewer on my list. So that might be fine. What other problem, if Dr. Richardson does this but doesn't tell anybody, and let's say Anne writes a really insightful review, and then Dr. Richardson submits that review to the journal because he says, this is a great review. What's the problem there? And maybe he even recommends publication. It's a good review, you know? What's the problem, though, with doing that? What's the problem for Anne? If you were Anne, what might upset you about that? She's not being recognized. She did the work, and she's not getting recognition for it. Again, one of the principles of authorship. I mean, being an author of a review is very much like being an author of a paper. You know, very often in the last issue of every volume, the journal will list a thank you note that says, we thank the following scientists who've reviewed articles for us in the last year. And if it's in my field and I look at that journal, I'll very often say, oh, I know those names. I know which articles they probably reviewed because those are the ones they're experts in. You know? So and I also know now these people are people who are good enough to be recognized as experts by an editor. So if Anne's done the work and she hasn't gotten the credit, she's been harmed. So it's much better to involve people in a way where they get credit. But Dr. Richardson's motives, as we say in question number 2, I mean, it's really a good thing. I mean, if I have a student in my lab or a postdoc, it's really a good thing for me to want to share information with them. After all, that's why they're coming to my lab. They want me to train them in science. But again, we can't share confidential information without appropriate permissions. Okay. And of course, let's go on to number 4. If Anne feels uncomfortable, how might she respond when this request is made? Well, she could remind Dr. Richardson just about what you knew when we answered question 1, she could say, you know, rather than giving me this article, why don't you ask the journal if they would like me to review it? I think it's always a good idea to maintain communication. How about if Dr. Richardson had distributed the article to all the people in his lab group for a discussion of the paper? That might be a great educational experience. Maybe then even the first-year graduate student would get the benefit from this new research. Anyone think that's a good idea? No. Again, it might be very interesting from the point of view of the student. It might be desirable. But again, that's not a good plan, because now all these people have this information and it isn't documented. You see, the thing about being a reviewer is, whether it's for a grant or a paper, is the person who asked you to be a reviewer knows who you are and knows you've been the reviewer. Other people are not supposed to see it. So this is even more problematic than simply sharing it with Anne. Now it's almost like publishing it. So that really is wrong. Yes?
It will also be wrong to use that first manuscript after the paper is already published.
Oh, if it's already published, it's in the public domain. Then you can do whatever you want. So if Dr. Richardson thinks this is a really good paper, as soon as that paper, let's say, appears online or in the journal, it's perfectly all right that day for him to email it to his whole lab group and say, take a look at this paper. Let's discuss it next week in our lab group meeting.
But I'm talking about the first one that you received as a reviewer, and you criticized it, and then you got knowledge of all the suggestions and all the stuff. You know, it could be quite different. So can you use the first one that was given?
Not, well, that's problematic. Probably you're better off not, because if it hasn't been published, you know, for example, it might be wrong. Maybe it isn't something you critiqued, but you know, it often happens. I know when I have a paper that's being prepared for publication, I'm constantly reading it, rereading it, and rereading it. Finally, it goes through the reviews, it gets accepted eventually, and then I'll get the page proofs. And it's happened to me more than once, I'm embarrassed to say, that as I'm reading the page proofs, usually, you know, it's typesetter's mistakes, and I see things that are wrong there, and I have to correct them. But more than once, not too many times, but it has happened to me that I see something, I say, that doesn't look quite right. And I look back and I say, oh my God, I had a mistake in my paper, and I didn't even realize it until I got these page proofs. Because, you know, when you're reading something, and it's your own work, you see it right, even if it's wrong, unfortunately. That's why, one of the reasons why we have other people review our work. So I have changed mistakes in page proofs to correct a mistake. So you wouldn't want to have someone focus on an earlier draft that might just have a mistake in it. You know? So again, I would say not. Now, what some journals will do is, in the interests of sharing, is they will, I've seen this, not too many journals do it, but a few will actually show you different drafts online. So they'll only publish one draft, but you can go back to the journal website and see the earlier drafts, so you can actually see what changes got made. Again, if it's published, and then posting on the web constitutes publication, yeah, then that's fair game. But if it's confidential, you probably shouldn't. In fact, what will often happen, I know when I get things to review, they'll very often even tell me, look, you can take this, you can photocopy it, you can print it, you can put it onto your disk drive, but we expect you to destroy it once you've sent back your review, because now it doesn't exist anymore. And if it comes out, you'll see it in its final form.